So we're going to talk about water here. Water is probably the most important nutrient for our livestock. Many of the nutrients, if we were to remove carbohydrates or protein, depending on the age of the animal, they could last probably a few days, maybe even a week without being fed protein or carbohydrates. Certainly lipids, we could remove those from the diet for some time. Minerals, some of the minerals, we could probably have certain minerals missing for months before we would find deficiencies. Whereas in most cases, if we were deficient in water, we would find problems relatively quickly. So water is very, very important for our livestock. And we have to make sure we have suitable amounts and suitable quality of the water for our livestock. Why? Well, number one, just for the welfare of our animals. We have to make sure we take care of our animals. We're responsible for their well-being. But tied to their welfare will also be the financial profitability of the shepherd. We have to make sure we're profitable. And one of the concepts that I will say probably 3 or 4 times even in this short video is we have to remember that water intake drives feed intake and feed intake drives production. In general, the more they drink, the more they eat, and the more they eat, the more they'll produce, whether that's milk or whether that's growth. Very, very important that we make sure we keep track of that. Now, what I said, suitable amounts of water, amounts and quality of the water. What does suitable mean? And so we need the water quality. We have to make sure that, for example, total dissolved solids, salinity, and so forth. I have a slide of that. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. We have to make sure that that is being taken care of. But also what depends on, for example, the suitable amounts of water depends on the environment that the animal's in. Temperature, when it's really cold outside, the animals drink less water than when it's really warm outside. Feed characteristics, am I feeding dry feeds or wet feeds? That can make a difference as well. I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. And then animal specifics. Breed differences, some differences there, but big differences would be stage of production. An animal that's producing more milk is going to require more water than an animal that's a maintenance animal, for example. This is an interesting study that was done quite some time ago, and they looked at how far will animals walk, how far will sheep specifically walk before they start decreasing their water intake. This study was done in Australia, and they found actually that the sheep will walk up to 4 kilometers before they decrease their water intake. So they'll walk actually really, really long distances before that happens. Now, I'm not saying that don't worry about where your water troughs are. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say the opposite here in a few minutes, because if you've worked at all with animals on pasture, you'll know that they tend to congregate and hang out around those water troughs. And so as long as they're by that water trough, they're not by where the feed is. And so certainly walking that distance, long distance, will decrease their feed intake over time. But besides the example of the distance being the issue, why they are not between their water and their feed, we should remember though that a 50% decrease in water intake will actually decrease feed intake by up to 25%. 25% is a massive drop in feed intake, and that would have a huge impact on milk production if it's a lactating animal, or on the growth of that lamb if it's a growing lamb. So this is where I kind of alluded to already. So for example, wet feeds, it makes a big difference whether I'm feeding a silage or a dry hay. Take, for example, corn silage. If I were feeding a kilogram of corn silage as fed, that means that animal will be consuming about 650 grams of water in that kilogram and about 350 kilograms of dry feed. If that animal is going to eat the same 350 grams of dry feed as a hay, it's going to probably be more like around 400 grams of total hay. So the animal is going to have maybe 50 grams or so of water in that particular hay. So one where it's getting 650 grams of water, one where they're only getting 50 grams of water. So the amount of water that the animal is going to have to drink then is going to be, there's going to be 600 mLs difference between those two feeds. The other thing we should recognize is gestation. Gestation will make the animal have to drink more water. As it's drinking that more water, especially as the litter size, as the litter grows, as the lambs grow in her uterus, but also litter size. If she has triplets, she's going to drink more water than if she has twins. And so we have to make sure again that we have sufficient water for that gestating ewe. Lactation, I've already mentioned this. It should be obvious that a lactating animal needs more water than a non-lactating animal, and the amount more water they need is more than just the amount of milk that they're producing. So a ewe that is a maintenance ewe and a ewe that's lactating, producing 1 liter of milk, it's not just an extra liter of water it needs more water than that. Or 2 liters, it's going to need more than just 2 liters of water on top of that. So we have to make sure that we take that into account. And of course, I've already mentioned this as well, with increased temperature, we have to make sure that we give enough water. Water quality, salinity, we want to make sure that the less dissolved salts in that water, the better. So the purer, the cleaner the water, the better impact it's going to have. pH as close to 7 is ideal. it has to be between 6.5 and 8.5 in order to keep the animal drinking and being healthy. Elements and compounds, there's often minerals in the water that come out of our wells and so forth. We just have to be careful that at high concentrations they don't become toxic. As an example, when I was young, I worked for a dairy farmer that had significant levels of sulfur in the water. And I never measured them. I was a kid, but it'd be interesting to know what those levels were, because at some level, sulfur actually inhibits the microbe that produces thiamine. And okay, so the bacteria that produces thiamine in the rumen of the cow is inhibited by high levels of sulfur. And so perhaps, and maybe their nutritionist knew at that time, knew that, and was actually supplementing their diet with a little bit extra thiamine just to make sure that we didn't have issues of thiamine deficiency going on. Other factors that can impact it is algae, especially if you have water troughs out in the sunshine. But if you've got still, warm, nutrient-rich water, and by the way, sheep don't wipe their mouth before they start eating, so the feed that they're consuming is going to land up in that water, making it nutrient-rich, and then you're going to get that fouling by that algae. It's going to make it unpalatable, and in some cases, it can also be toxic. Here's just an example of a water test, or what, this isn't a water test, this is showing you what the average kind of analysis report. This is for dairy cows and veal calves, but you get an idea of what the average is, what you expect those numbers to be around, and where for cattle, where it can start to become an issue. And so it just gives you a little bit of an idea of the type of things: dissolved solids, we're looking at chloride, sulfates, fluoride, and we can go right down to mercury and so forth, copper, lead, and so forth in the water, and what we would consider to have safe levels. So I think it's a good idea that perhaps once a year you send a water sample off to get analyzed. It's one of those things we all talk about doing. We probably don't do it as often as we should. Send a water sample off, get it analyzed, see what it is, so you know where you're sitting in terms of water quality for your animals. So again, I've already mentioned this a little bit, that livestock tend to congregate around the water source in the pasture, and this means they're staying away from that good quality feed, right? They're not going to abandon that water until they're hungry, so they're going to stand by that water trough. Once they get hungry, they will go out, but I don't want them to wait till they're hungry to go out. I want them to go out right away and start grazing. The other thing that happens is it damages the pasture by those water troughs. Wherever you have that water trough, the animals congregate around there and they stamp down the grass. You're going to start getting mud. You have a higher risk of foot rot in those areas. And so if you can have some kind of watering system that's relatively mobile, it makes your rotation systems more simple. Okay, so again, if it's a great distance, you can move that water with the animals to make sure that they are staying close to it. I was on a beef farm one time where the guy had a really nice rotational system, and he had one water area where the cows could come out and drink water. And sure enough, when I arrived on his farm, all the cows were in that area where the water was. And so we chased them because we wanted to see them grazing. So we chased them back into the pasture. And immediately when they got into that pasture, they started consuming the pasture. So it wasn't that they were hungry. They were hungry enough to eat, but they just weren't hungry enough to walk back yet. So make sure that you do that. And again, it keeps the water moving with the feed supply if you can do that kind of rotational system. Here's some examples I found online, some neat systems. People come up with these little troughs. I like them. One they can just tow around with the ATV. Another one, again, probably with the ATV as well. One there looks like it's just basically an old lawnmower with a lid put on it, with a water trough put on top of it. I like that one has a roof over it because that keeps the sun out of the water, and so it decreases the algae levels. And on the bottom left there, you can see there's examples also of water where we have water lines that are going to be you can flush them during the winter because you have to keep them empty during the winter, but that where we can get the spigots and we can get the water to those animals where they are. I would recommend that if standing water is available, it's better to pump that water into a trough rather than let animals drink the water out of that standing water. So if you have a pond or something like that and the water's clear in there, it's clean, doesn't have too much algae in it, I would highly recommend you get a pump that pumps that water up to a water trough. I've seen different examples of this. One example I like, there's a water trough at the top of further up the bank from the pond, and there was just a solar panel that pumped water up into that water trough. Then they actually had overflow on the other end of the tank that would take the water back to the pond. And so the water was kind of constantly being flushed through there if there was enough sunshine to keep it moving, and there was enough water volume in there that the sheep could come in and drink if they wanted some to consume there. Fenced off the pond area so the animals don't go in that pond area and contaminate with their feces and urine. Water space requirements, again, there is a code of practice, and in that they suggest that we have enough water for they count, for example, 10 rams, 40 to 50 ewes, 40 ewe lamb pairs or 50 to 75 lambs. I think that should be just lambs, not lamb pairs. And that would be a surface area of about 1 foot squared. Okay, that's about how much they need. I would argue that we don't necessarily want to have too much water space as well, because then the water sits too long and it will start to, again, spoil over time because of sunlight and so forth. So if we have a limited amount of water where they have to drink it, they keep on drinking it, and that keeps that water fresh and clean. So pay attention to those types of numbers that you need. Again, in hot weather or for lactating animals, you probably want to increase this a little bit more than, for example, in colder weather or in other maintenance, for example, sheep or something like that. Now, this is a slide that I include in my talk when I'm in my dairy cattle nutrition one, and I put this into the sheep one. First of all, I have to say we don't know. We don't know what the answer is to the sheep because to my knowledge, nobody's actually looked at it in sheep. However, if you're a dairy sheep farmer, this is something that you probably want to think about. I would be surprised if it would be very different. There are some things that are significantly different between sheep and cows. We have to remember sheep are not just small cows, but there are some things that are also quite similar as well. And we know for a fact that dairy cow will drink 50 to 60% of its daily water intake immediately after milking. Okay, so if you have a cow that's producing 30 kilograms of milk, she's going to need to drink between 120 and 150 liters of water. It's about 4 or 5 liters per kilogram of milk. And if a cow is consuming about 50 kilograms of feed in a day, that's going to have about 25 liters in the water. So that means we need about another 125 liters of water each day to be consumed. And 33 liters of that water will come right after milking time. 33 liters, that's about 5 gallon pill, 1.5 of those. Okay, so it's a significant amount of water that they're going to drink. And having that water available as close as possible outside that parlor will increase their chances of water intake. If you have a situation where you have a water bowl there and you got, let's say, 12 cows leaving that parlor at once and only 3 cows can drink at it, the boss cows are going to get their water. They're probably not going to drink as much water as they would have because they're getting pushed from the behind, right? They're strong enough to stay there, but after a while, they're going to give up and just leave. And then the next ones are going to come in. But by that time, those ones have finished drinking, the next group from the parlor is coming out. And so you have to make sure you have enough water space that they can all drink. Are any of those sheep going to die of thirst? No, they're not going to die of thirst. They'll wait. They'll go back and they'll lay down. They'll come back and they'll get their water later. However, they're not going to drink as much as they would have, which is, remember, water intake drives feed intake drives production. So make sure if you're a dairy sheep farmer, you have an adequate water supply right outside that parlor. Let the sheep go over there, get that water consumed, and then they can go back into the barn and start consuming feed for you. Water fouling, we want to make sure that the animals don't defecate in the water bowls. Okay, so it's a good idea to have a step around the water bowl. The step doesn't have to be very large for the sheep, 6 inches wide or so. You don't want it too wide because otherwise the animals can stand up there and then they can still defecate in. So relatively small, and I would say 6 to 9 inches high or so. Sheep can stand up there with their front feet up on there and drink the water out of the water bowl. But what the animals tend not to do is animals tend not to drink with their back feet up higher than their front feet. So that means their back feet they're not going to have their back feet up on that step, and therefore they're less likely to either defecate or urinate into that water bowl. Again, I've already mentioned as well, pumping that water is going to also have a better impact, pumping that water to a trough rather than letting the animals drink out of standing water on the field. So there we have just a brief introduction, brief discussion on water, the importance of water. And again, please do not forget water. One thing I should mention on that, again, whatever type of water system you're going to be putting in, think about the water bowl that is going to be the easiest to clean. If you have a water bowl that's difficult to clean, where you have to have a special tool to open it, you have to reach around to get the plug out, pull the plug out, and then do all that, you're just likely not going to do it. At least you're not going to do it as often as you should do it. So if you can come up with a system, I love the water bowls where you can tip them, you just tip the water bowl, it's flushed out immediately, back up, and it's ready to go, refill, and continue giving that animal water. Keep it simple because it's most likely to happen when it's simple.